Chapter 1 of The Electronic Mind Reader, a Rick Brant Science Adventure story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cinda J. M. The Electronic Mind Reader, a Rick Brant Science Adventure story by Harold L. Goodwin. Chapter 1 The $1 Million Gimmick. Rick Brant stretched luxuriously and slid down to a half-reclining, half-sitting position in his dad's favorite library armchair. He called, "Barbie, hurry up!" Don Scott looked up from his adjustment of the television picture. "What's the rush? The show hasn't started yet." Rick explained, "She likes the commercials." A moment later, Barbara Brant appeared in the doorway, hastily finishing a donut. Rick cocked an eyebrow at her. "If you're going to eat, you might as well bring a plateful so we can have some too." Barbie gulped. "Sorry, I didn't intend to have a donut. I went to the kitchen to see if Mom and Dad wanted to watch the show, and they were having donuts and milk." "Never mind," Scotty said. "We forgive you. We'll get ours later. Are Mom and Dad coming?" "Maybe later. Now be quiet, please, so I can hear the commercial." Dismal, the Brant's pup, wandered in and paused at Rick's chair to have his ears scratched before taking up his favorite position, under the TV table. Rick obliged, and the shaggy puppy groaned with pleasure. "Why all the interest in a breakfast food commercial?" Scotty asked. "The announcer is cute," Barbie stated. This made no sense to Scotty. He stretched out on the rug in front of the set, then rolled over on his back and looked up at the girl. "I don't get it. Then why do you eat crummies for breakfast instead of the hay this guy sells?" "The crummies announcer is cuter," Barbie explained patiently. The boys grinned and fell silent as the cereal salesman went into his spiel. Barbie perched on the edge of a chair and listened attentively. Rick watched his sister's expressive face, chuckling to himself. Barbie always listened to the commercials. It was only fair, she insisted, and the boys went along with her wishes. Come right down to it, Rick thought. Listening to commercials was the price they had to pay for the entertainment. Not listening meant not paying the price. He didn't think that the point was particularly important, but there was a small element of justice in Barbie's view. Their Sunday evenings on Spindrift, the private island off the New Jersey coast, usually ended with this particular program. The members of the Spindrift staff were not TV enthusiasts at best, and they cared little about the program. Mr. and Mrs. Brant sometimes watched, more for the sake of being companionable than for the sake of the program, but usually the three young people watched alone. The program was a typical quiz. Contestants who were expert on a particular category returned week after week on their build-up to a grand prize, which was $250,000. This quiz, however, had elements that the younger Brants liked. In the first place, the contestants were ordinary people. The producer didn't seem to go in for the odd characters as other programs did. For the past few weeks, the hero contestant had been an 18-year-old coal miner from Pennsylvania. There was nothing unusual about him, except for one thing. He had become interested in the mining of precious stones, and from there he had studied their history. He was an expert on historical gems. Now, as the master of ceremonies greeted the miner, Barbie said with admiration, "He has a wonderful personality, and imagine him knowing so much about gems." Rick draped a leg over the chair arm. "See, Scotty? The perfect reaction." "What do you mean?" Barbie demanded indignantly. "He absolutely does have a wonderful personality, and I think it's amazing that a coal miner should know so much about gems." Scotty grinned up at her. "Rick means people can't get on quiz shows unless they have good TV personalities. And how much appeal would the show have if a gem expert answered questions on gems?" "I see what you mean," Barbie agreed. "That's it," Rick nodded. "Anyway, I agree that the miner has a swell personality, and he certainly knows his gems." The three fell quiet as the quiz began. The questions were really tough, filled with a kind of detail no one could be expected to remember, but which good contestants always did. Then, at a crucial moment, the miner hesitated over identification of a date in the long and bloody history of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. "If only we could help him," Barbie wailed. We don't know either, Scotty reminded. But Rick suddenly realized that they did know, or at least had the answer available. He was certain it could be found in one of his father's books, if not in the encyclopedia. But even if they had time to look it up, which they didn't, the contestant couldn't hear them in a soundproof booth. Or could they get a message to him if they were part of the studio audience? Or was there some other way? It was typical of Rick when faced with an apparently insoluble problem to look for an answer. The miner finally remembered, and the three breathed a mutual sigh of relief, but the ordeal was not yet over because the questioning had several parts. Next came a quiz on the Star of Africa. The questions asked, the camera began switching from the contestant's face to the tense faces in the audience. A woman, probably the miner's mother, a man with a beard, a man with a hearing aid. Rick suddenly sat up straight. He had it. He knew how the information could be handed to the contestant. At least, he knew in theory. He sat back and started to work out the details. The miner made it. Limp and happy, he came out of the booth, shook hands with the MC, and staggered off with an armload of books containing answers to next week's series of questions. The announcer went into the final commercial with Barbie and Scotty listening attentively. Rick didn't listen. He had a wonderful idea in which he was putting the finishing touches. As the program shifted, Scotty reached up and turned off the set. Dismal left his place under the table and trotted off to the kitchen. "Me for a donut," Scotty announced. Barbie was still spellbound by the miner's success. "It's just fantastic, utterly, how much he knows." She shook her smooth blonde head. "I wish I knew that much about something." "Want to win $1 million?" Rick asked. "Who doesn't?" Barbie returned dreamily. Suddenly she stared. "You have a look on your face," she stated. "Rick Brant, you're cooking something up." Rick grinned. "I can win the quiz," he said casually. "It's easy. Let me know if either of you want to win. Of course, you might end up in jail if you're not real careful, but I think it'll work." Scotty looked his disbelief. "Easy, huh? What are you expert on?" "Nothing," Rick said airily, "and anything. Of course, we all know you're an expert on eating, but that's not a category, that's capacity." Barbie gave what might be described as a ladylike sneer. Rick shook his head. "It's terrible the way people in this house have no faith in genius. Just terrible," he sighed heavily. Scotty watched him suspiciously. "All right, Dr. Brant, give us the great idea." "Okay." Rick waved at the encircling shelves of books. "Pick a subject, any subject, so long as it's contained in a very few references, like The Life of a Bee, or The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, or The Life of Dickens." Barbie said obligingly, "All right, I picked Ben Franklin. Now what?" "We get the major books on old Ben, plus the copy of the encyclopedia we need. Then we set up an index, and we put principal categories of information on file cards. For Ben, we'd need sayings of Poor Richard, and the dates they appeared, and where. And we'd need a list of his inventions, plus the dates, and so on. Generally, we fix things so we can find any answer in a few seconds." Barbie shook her head. "That would be awfully hard. It would take weeks, and whoever operated the file would have to know it nearly by heart." Rick agreed. "But isn't $1 million worth a few weeks of effort?" Rick's famous father, Hartson Brant, walked into the library in time to hear the last comment. His eyebrows went up. "What's all this megabuck talk?" That was a new word to Barbie. "What talk?" In the metric system, meg means million, so megabuck is $1 million, if you'll pardon the slang. "Oh, well, Rick is going to win a megabuck." Rick explained rapidly about choosing a subject that could be cross-indexed for ease of reference, then went on. "After we get the subject all set, we choose the contestant. It has to be a real person. We'd need several contestants because the gimmick could be worked on every big money quiz, maybe more than once on each. Of course, the contestants would have to be members of the Megabuck Mob, as we'll call it." "I like that," Barbie said enthusiastically. "That would make me a Megabuck Mall, wouldn't it?" "Yep," Scotty agreed. "And Rick can be the Megabuck Mole." "And you can be the Megabuck Moose, you big ox," Rick finished. He was warming up to his subject now. There had to be a hole in it somewhere, but he hadn't found it yet. Anyway, we have Ben Franklin on file cards, and Barbie studied carefully to be the first contestant. Then what? Someone asks who Ben Franklin was, and I say that he started a chain of department stores, Barbie said helpfully. Not you, Rick denied. You know all the right answers. And why? Because the Megabuck mob is behind you. The Megabuck moose is going through the cards, and the Megabuck mole is feeding the answers to the Megabuck memory machine. And the Megabuck mall, in maidenly modesty, mumbles madly. Help him, Scotty interrupted. His lips are stuck together. He can't say anything but mmm. But Barbie was interested. And how does the memory machine madly machinate and murmur the answers? Rick murmured. That is the secret. Hartson Brant threatened his son with a handy volume of the physics handbook. Out with it, young man. This is no time to keep secrets now that we're all partners in the deal. Rick sighed. He waved at Barbie. Look at her. So young, so smart, so pretty. But the poor girl has a very slight handicap. She has to wear a hearing aid. Scotty got it then. Hey, Rick, that's great. The hearing aid would be a radio receiver. Barbie got it too. She finished in a rush. And the Megabuck mob would be watching on TV and digging out the answers, and the memory machine would be a radio transmitter. It wouldn't matter about the soundproof booth, Scotty chimed in, because radio will go right through the walls. Hartson Brant held both hands to his head in mock horror. To think that my only son should turn out to be a halfway criminal genius. Rick glanced up at his father suspiciously. Halfway? He knew from the word that the scientist had immediately spotted some reason why his gimmick wouldn't work. Never mind, son. Hartson Brant put a hand on Rick's shoulder. The Megabuck Mall can bake you a cake with a file in it so you can break out of jail. I'm sure you won't mind being a fugitive from justice. A harsh growl from the doorway caused them all to whirl around, startled. He'll never get a chance. The Megabuck mob is pinched as of right now. The federal government is taking over this island. Crouched in the doorway, submachine gun cradled in his arms, was an officer of the United States Coast Guard. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Electronic Mind Reader, a Rick Brant Science Adventure story by Harold L. Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Cinda J.M. Chapter 2, The Invasion of Spindrift. Hartson Brant reacted first. He said severely, I've tried to teach Rick that one never points a firearm at people. You're setting him a bad example. Then the scientist smiled and held out his hand. This is an unexpected pleasure, Steve. Why didn't you let us know you were coming? And why the disguise? Steve Ames, a chief agent of JANIG, the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Group, with which Spindrift had so often worked, straightened up and grinned. He winked at the astonished young people. Hi, gang! The trio chorused. Hi, Steve! Steve shook hands with Hartson Brant, then explained, I'm not really setting a bad example. If you'll look closely, you'll see that the bolt of this chopper is open, the safety is on, and there isn't a round in the chamber. But why carry it at all? Barbie demanded. Rick closed his mouth. He'd been about to ask the same thing. He felt a tingle of excitement. When Steve Ames showed up on Spindrift, a venture wasn't far off. The federal agent came to Spindrift only for help, and then only when his usual sources had failed. The first time, in the case of the Whispering Box mystery, the Spindrifters had worked with Steve in Washington. Recently, quite by accident, the boys had become involved in a JANIG case while vacationing in the Virgin Islands. As the case of the whaling octopus came to an end, Steve had warned them that he might see them soon, and now here he was. The reason for the chopper is a long story, Steve answered Barbie, but the reason for the uniform is simple. It's mine. Then Steve, who had never before appeared as anything but a civilian, was actually a full commander in the Coast Guard. Rick marveled at how little they really knew about their friend. He certainly excelled at keeping his mouth shut. Probably he was a reserve officer. I think you look handsome in it, Barbie said dreamily. The boys had kidded her before about getting all misty-eyed when Steve showed up. Actually, Steve was a very handsome young man, so Barbie's mild crush was understandable. "That makes it worth wearing," Steve said gallantly, and Barbie beamed. Hartson Brant detached a key from his chain and handed it to Steve with a flourish. "You said you were taking over the island, I believe? You'll need the house key." Rick smiled. That was his father's way of leading the conversation back to Steve's reason for coming without taking the edge off their delight at the unexpected reunion. But Steve was not to be pushed into business talk so easily. He looked at Rick. "You and your schemes. I think I'll poke it full of holes just to show you that crime doesn't pay." Scotty asked curiously, "How much did you hear?" "The whole plan. I've been casing the joint, as we say." "Okay, Rick, you must have considered that a rash of winners wearing hearing aids would attract attention and comment. How are you going to prevent it?" Rick answered automatically, his mind not really on his great idea anymore. So Steve had been casing the island? He replied, "Not all the hearing aids would be visible. For instance, I could make a receiver for Barbie that would be an ornamental plastic band to wear the way girls wear barrettes, or whatever they call them. Or I could fit a receiver into a special pair of glasses. There's one type of hearing aid that's built into glasses, you know." "I do know," Steve agreed. "All right, I'll try again. Each contestant that looks good to the program people gets a thorough quizzing on the chosen subject before being accepted. That's to find out if they're really experts. How are you going to handle it?" Rick hadn't known about that. He pondered for a moment. "That means we'd have to prepare a hidden transmitter, too, so we could help out during the examination. It could be done. The contestants could wear the gadget strapped to their legs under their skirts or trousers." Steve was enjoying Rick's ready responses. His eyes twinkled. "You'll have to use very limited range on your megabuck mob transmitter and a very high frequency. Otherwise, the Federal Communications Commission would pick you up, use a direction finder, and move in on your operation. They might locate you anyway, even on low power and ultra high frequency. How are you going to lick that?" Rick held up his hands in surrender. I can't take the chance on getting the federal government into the act." "Gosh, I'd have the FCC, the FBI, and maybe a dozen others on my trail. I quit. The Megabug mob is hereby dissolved." Steve looked disappointed. "And I was hoping your plan was foolproof. I was about to buy stock in the mob." The amusement in his eyes belied the words. Hartson Brant laughed. "I'm glad you're the one that stuck a pin in his bubble, Steve. The way Barbie bakes cakes, I'm not sure Rick could ever break one to get the file out." Steve chuckled. "The records are full of foolproof, get-rich-quick schemes like this one, and the jails are full of halfway criminal geniuses, too. But don't overlook the advantages of an eat-proof cake. It might come in handy to throw at the guards during the getaway." The young people laughed, too. Then Barbie sobered suddenly. "Rick, could you really put one of those things in my hair?" He had an image of the gadget in his mind and knew it would work. "Sure, sis, why?" "An idea I want to talk to you about later." She turned to Steve and asked anxiously, "You do know Rick was only fooling, don't you, Steve? He wouldn't steal anything from anyone, honestly." Steve nodded. "I do, Barbie. I won't throw him in jail this time. I might need him." "Is that what you're here for?" she asked. "I need you all," Steve said. He motioned to chairs. "Let's sit down. Can Mrs. Brant join us?" Hartson Brant went to get her, while the young people started to deluge Steve with questions. He held up a hand in protest. "Wait until the whole family's here, please." In a moment, Mrs. Brant had joined them and greeted Steve cordially. Then the young agent got serious. "I was only partly joking when I said I want to take over Spindrift. I really do, in a way. Here's why. We've had a team of scientists working on a project that's of the greatest importance to national defense. There were 4 in the team, all top-notchers. Hartson, I'm sure you'll know some, if not all of them, by reputation." Steve removed the ammunition clip from his submachine gun and sighted through the barrel, then let the bolt ram home with a sharp click. "It was my job to guard the project. As you know, I had to go to the Virgin Islands, but I left one of my best men in charge, and he did his job thoroughly. I'm satisfied about that. No unknown person has been near the project office, and no unknowns have been in close contact with any of the team. Yet 2 of them are in the hospital." "Sick or wounded?" Scotty asked. "Neither, really. We don't know what's wrong. Their minds suddenly ceased to function." Hartson Brant leaned forward. You mean they're unconscious? Steve shook his head. Not in the usual sense. It's as though all their thoughts and memories had suddenly been scrambled. Do you ever see a teletype machine in operation, particularly one that suddenly went haywire? Rick had. The news machine did that over at the Whiteside Morning Record. It was typing out clear copy, and then suddenly there wasn't anything but gibberish. That's it, Steve agreed, and that's the best analogy I can think of for what's happened to two scientists. When a teletype goes haywire, one moment everything's clear and perfect, the next everything is scrambled. All the letters are there, but they no longer make words. The scientists talk words, common everyday words, but the words don't make thoughts or sentences, just sounds. How awful, Mrs. Brant murmured, and Barbie looked horrified. Rick searched his memory for anything similar he'd ever read about or heard of, but there was nothing. From the expression on their faces, his father and Scotty were equally puzzled. Well, even though I have absolutely no evidence of foul play, I decided not to take chances, Steve went on. I got one of the scientists to go along with my plan. He shares my concern simply on the basis that no known disease would affect human beings in this way, and two scientists of the same team being stricken with an unknown ailment is too much coincidence. He's wise, Hartson Brant agreed. He also has a family. The other scientist does not. He's a crusty old bachelor who thinks the whole thing is nonsense and insists on staying right where he is. How do we fit in? Scotty asked. You said you needed all of us. That's right. I want to relocate the project at Spindrift. Using the cooperative scientist as a basis for new staff? Rick inquired. Yes. We went through some of the most complicated maneuvers you ever saw to get him out of Washington with his family. I'm certain his movements cannot be traced, so his presence here will be a complete secret. But it isn't just the scientist. I'm also asking you to take in his family, consisting of his wife and daughter. Of course we will, Mrs. Brant said warmly. Steve turned to Barbie. I think you'll enjoy it because the girl's just your age and she's very friendly and pleasant young lady. Barbie looked pleased and excited. What's her name? Janice Miller. Is the scientist Dr. Walter Miller by any chance? Hartson Brant asked quickly. Exactly right. Do you know him? Not personally, we've never met, but a few years ago we carried on a very extensive correspondence on the subject of energy levels and nuclear isomers. Steve grinned. I won't pretend to know what you're talking about, but I'm glad you'll have something in common. Will you and your staff join him to make up a new project team? I think we can, Hartson Brant said thoughtfully. Some of us can put aside what we're doing. I'll have to know a little more about the project, of course. The federal agent nodded. Dr. Miller can give you the details personally. Rick expressed a thought that had been on his mind. We're sort of isolated here, but we're certainly not cut off from the world. Our friends visit us, and we go to the mainland almost every day. How do we explain who these people are? I'm sure you don't want their names to get out. I'll give you a cover story. Their name is Morrison. You met them through Dr. Ernest while you were in the Virgin Islands. They were very hospitable, and you're simply returning their hospitality. They know the islands well from vacations spent there, so no one will trip them up on details. How about details of our trip? Scotty asked. They've been briefed thoroughly by me. You can check them and fill in any missing details. Barbie giggled. I'm glad that you didn't have any doubts about our taking them in, Steve. Steve knows we're available anytime he needs us and for anything we can give, Rick said. Steve smiled his thanks. Well, now you can guess why I showed up with a hunk of artillery under my wing. I had to be sure there wasn't a reception party waiting. You never can tell about information leaks, no matter how careful you are. So I landed at the back end of the island with a squad of men, and we went over the place with a fine-tooth comb. I didn't walk in until I was certain there wasn't a stranger on the island, including strangers you might not have known about. Hartson Brant rose. Well, I think we've settled all initial details except where we put the Millers, or rather the Morrisons. Can you bring them tomorrow? Steve rose too. As Rick and Barbie said, I didn't have any doubts. How about tonight? Tonight? Barbie gasped. Are they here? Almost. They're on a cutter offshore. If it isn't convenient, I can keep them overnight. Of course it's convenient, Mrs. Brant said firmly. We'll put Mr. and Mrs. Morrison in John Gordon's room. He's still out west. And we'll take the spare twin bed out of Hobart Zircon's room and put Janice in with Barbie. Bring them ashore right away, Steve. Barbie and I will get busy and Rick and Scotty can move the spare bed. Wonderful. Steve walked out to the porch and coughed twice. Rick hurried to his side just in time to see one of the trees of the orchard yield up a dark shadow that turned out to be a Coast Guard petty officer, carbine at the ready and walkie-talkie slung over his shoulder. "Let me have your horn, Smitty," Steve requested. The Coast Guardman gave Rick a curious look as he handed Steve the phone. The agent said, "Nevada, this is Texas. Deliver the goods." The reply was, "Texas, this is Nevada. The package is in the mail." Steve handed the phone back to the Coast Guardman and ordered, "Get the boys together and return to the ship, Smitty. Repeat their instructions. They don't know where they've been, and they don't know what they've been doing." Smitty grinned. "Aye, aye, sir. That won't be hard. None of us really know where we've been or what we've been doing." "Life is easier that way," Steve said. "Shove off now." "Aye, aye, sir." The guardsman faded into the night. "Let's move furniture," Steve suggested. For the next few moments, the house was a flurry of activity. Rick and Scotty dismantled the twin bed in Zircon's room, explaining only to the big scientist that unexpected company had arrived. Zircon, engrossed in a theoretical problem, scarcely noticed. By the time Mrs. Brant was satisfied with arrangements and had counted the towels for the third time, Steve called from downstairs that the boat was arriving. Rick, Scotty, and Barbie ran to Steve's side and walked with him toward the landing where the Spindrift boats were moored. Dismal had paid little attention to the proceedings, but now, fearful of being left behind, the pup raced ahead of the group. The boat carrying the Morrisons, for so Rick was already conditioning himself to think of them, was one. "Great Grandma's ghost!" Steve exclaimed. "I forgot to tell you they have a cat." Dismal shot by them, followed by an enormous creature with glowing eyes that yowled at the top of its lungs in what was probably very coarse language to anyone who spoke cat talk. Dismal had at last met his match and was beating an inglorious retreat. Just as Rick was about to take up the chase and rescue the pup, the cat decided to break off the engagement. The ruffled fur subsided slightly as the animal turned from the chase and approached the four who had been hurrying to the pier. In the beam of Steve's flashlight, Rick saw that the cat was a huge blue Persian, and though he knew little about cats, he recognized that this was an aristocrat of its kind. The Persian gave a meow of greeting, then walked up and rubbed against Barbie's legs. It gave out a noise that reminded Rick of a wood rasp rubbing over a piece of broken pine. The cat was purring. Barbie had stamped her foot angrily at the sight of Dismal being forced to retreat to the house, but the cat was too much for her. "You beautiful thing!" she exclaimed, and picked the creature up. It responded by purring louder. Rick grinned. On the pet level, at least, the Morrison invasion was off to a fast start. He hoped the incident wasn't symbolic. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Electronic Mind Reader, a Rick Brant Science Adventure story by Harold L. Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Cinda J. M. Chapter 3, A System Within a System. When Rick came down to breakfast the next morning, the day was already hours old for his father, Steve Ames, Julius Weiss, Parnell Winston, and Dr. Walter Miller, alias Morrison. The scientists had been closeted in the library with Steve since dawn, their talks interrupted only by Mrs. Brant serving coffee to the group. Steve, too, had remained overnight. Barbie and Scotty were around the island somewhere with Janice. Mrs. Brant and Mrs. Morrison were in the kitchen, getting acquainted and finding that they had friends in common. It wasn't that Rick had slept late. He was on time. Everyone else had gotten up early. Rick told himself that he was the only calm member of the family, but underneath he was a little chagrined. If he had risen earlier, he might have been able to take part in the talks now going on in the library. The Morrisons had been so tired from the strain of getting out of Washington undetected and from the trip in the confined quarters of the Coast Guard cutter that they had gone to bed almost immediately. Dr. Morrison turned out to be a tall man with a kind, tired face, steel-rimmed glasses, and a shock of curly white hair. Mrs. Morrison was a pleasant, stylish woman whose reaction was a mixture of pure pleasure at finding herself in the comfortable Brant home and embarrassment at the circumstances that had forced her to impose herself on strangers. Rick had liked both Morrisons immediately. His reaction to Janice was favorable, too. He admitted that she was a remarkably pretty girl, as dark as Barbie was fair, and of about the same height and slimness. She hadn't said a great deal, and he decided at once that she was shy. Barbie had taken to her immediately, and she to Barbie. The last thing Rick had heard before falling asleep was the two of them talking and giggling in the room down the hall. He walked into the dining room, hoping he wasn't too late for breakfast, and stopped short, stifling a laugh at the sight that met his eyes. The Morrisons' cat, whose name was Shaw, was crouched on one of the dining room chairs. Dismal was sniffing around beneath the chair, obviously looking for the cat. As Rick watched, Dismal gave up the search and walked from under the chair. Instantly, he was batted on the nose from above by a paw that moved with supersonic speed. Rick laughed as Dismal gave a cry of pure frustration and headed for the kitchen at a trot. The cat had been playing since the blow was struck with claws sheathed. If Shaw had wanted to hurt the pup, raking claws could have torn deep furrows. Rick stroked the silky fur and Shaw purred hoarsely. He hadn't had much experience with cats, but he liked this one. The Persian had a sense of humor. Rick went into the kitchen and consoled Dismal. After bidding good morning to his mother and Mrs. Morrison, the pup rolled over on his back and played dead, his only trick. The boy scratched Dismal's stomach until the pup's hind leg flailed in delighted ecstasy. "Am I too late for breakfast?" Rick asked his mother. "Of course not. We'll be ready in 10 minutes. Rick wandered out to the screened front porch that was the Brant summer living room. The ocean was calm this morning. He searched the horizon for some sign of the Coast Guard cutter. There was none, which didn't surprise him. Steve was too old a hand to attract attention to Spindrift by having a government craft waiting offshore. Barbie, Jan, and Scotty were walking from the long, low-gray laboratory building on the southeast corner of the island, past the place where the Sky Wagon, his plane, usually was staked down. His landing strip ran along the seaward edge of the island, from the lab buildings to the front of the house. However, the plane still carried the pontoons with which it had been fitted for the Virgin Island trip, and for the time being it was drawn ashore at Pirates Field. Presently the trio joined him on the porch. Jan smiled and said good morning in her soft voice. Scotty said, "I thought you were going to sleep all day." Barbie came to Rick's defense. He was tired. After all, it's hard work to get wonderful ideas like the one he had last night. Apparently Barbie had told Jan all about it because the girl asked, "Can I be a member of the Megabuck mob?" There seemed to be just a touch of wistfulness about the way she added, "You always seem to be having adventures of one sort or another at Spindrift." Rick answered, "Please don't believe everything Barbie tells you. She exaggerates, sort of." "I do not," Barbie answered emphatically. "We do have adventures. Besides, Jan already knew about some of them because she read about Spindrift in the papers, and she's already a member of the mob because I invited her." Rick interpreted Barbie's glare correctly. It said that if he wasn't gracious and nice to their new guest, he would have his sister to reckon with, and as he knew full well, she was no mean adversary. "Fine," he said. "Welcome to the mob, Miss Morrison. We'll assign you the subject of economic history." "Jan, please," she answered, then smiled shyly. "But couldn't I have another subject? I'm just not the type to know much about economics, I guess." "That's just the point," Scotty explained. Barbie had a serious look on her pert face. Of course, Rick's idea about stealing $1 million from quiz shows was just a joke, but Rick, you gave me an idea, if you'll cooperate. "It depends on the idea," Rick answered warily. "Oh, don't be so cautious. I'm not trying to trap you into taking me on any trips." Barbie referred to the promise she had once wangled out of her brother that she could go on the next expedition, a promise that had gotten the Spindrift young people entangled in a hazardous adventure in the far-off South Seas. Rick perched on the arm of a sofa. "Okay, let's have it." "Well, I was thinking about the Harvest Moon show at school," she explained in an aside to Jan. "Every October, the high school puts on a big variety show in the city auditorium to raise money for the school athletic fund. Rick said he could make me a radio receiver that I could wear in my hair." "He can," Scotty interjected. "Remember the control radios we made for the Tractosaur? He could make one for you the same way." The Tractosaur was a thinking bulldozer the Spindrift scientists had designed. Barbie continued, "I know you can make a small transmitter that will fit in your pocket, because that's all the tractosaur control was, really. Well, if I wore a receiver that no one could see, and if you carried a transmitter that no one could see, we could put on the most wonderful mind-reading act in history. Rick's quick imagination elaborated on Barbie's words. It was a great idea. He could work among the audience while Barbie sat blindfolded on the stage. He would choose a person in the audience and ask for something from wallet or purse and whisper, "Please let me have your driver's license." "Thank you. Mr. Charles Rogers, is it? Where is 3218 Newark Drive?" "Oh, over by the airfield." "Well, Mr. Rogers, let me see if I can transmit all this information telepathically to my sister." Then he would hold up the driver's license and say loudly, "What have I here?" And Barbie, who had heard every whispered word, would answer. He would coax the information out of her, and the audience would be baffled. "Sensational," he complimented her. "We'll do it." "Brant and Brant," Scotty intoned. "The marvels of the universe. See the living proof of the science of parapsychology. Mystifying, terrifying. A scientific phenomenon without parallel has baffled the leading minds of the world." Scotty's quick mind also had caught the implications of Barbie's idea. Jan Morrison was a scientist's daughter, too, and printed electronic circuits were no mystery to her. She said enthusiastically, "You could even do mind reading at a distance." "How?" Barbie asked. "Well, if there were two transmitters, Scotty could have one too. He could go to someone outside the auditorium, like the mayor or some other official, and have him write a sentence on a sheet of paper, which Scotty could read over his shoulder. Then Barbie, on the auditorium stage, would ask everyone to look at their watches and say that the mayor had just written so-and-so on a sheet of paper, then burned it. Scotty would bring the mayor to the auditorium, and Barbie would tell him what she had said and at what time, and ask him if it was right. Of course, it would be. Rick looked at the girl with new respect. That was a very good gimmick indeed. He said as much. Barbie put her arm around Jan's waist. "We'll be sure to invite you to the show. Won't it be fun?" "If it's safe for us to let people know where we are by then," Jan said somberly. They fell silent at the reminder that Jan's presence was far more serious than a casual visit. Finally, Rick said, "We'll get to work on the sets this afternoon." "Make it tomorrow," Barbie said quickly. "I sort of promised Jan something." Rick and Scotty exchanged glances. "I said you and Scotty would teach her how to use the aqualungs." Rick breathed a sigh of relief. That would be no hardship. He and Scotty needed practice anyway. They had hardly used the lungs since returning from the Virgin Islands. Mrs. Brant summoned them to breakfast, and they walked in to find Steve and the scientists gathered at the big table. "Got everything settled?" Rick asked. "Just about," Steve replied. "We have a job for you, though." Rick's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Your father and Weiss will need to pay a quick trip to Washington. I want you to take them in the Sky Wagon." "When?" Scotty inquired. "Tomorrow morning. You'll come back tomorrow afternoon." Over breakfast, Rick tried to get more information from the agent. "Exactly what are we working on, Steve?" Ames sipped steaming coffee thoughtfully. "Ever heard of a weapon system?" Rick had. "It's a weapon so complicated with so many parts that it's actually a system instead of a simple weapon. I think the term is used mostly for missiles." "You think right. Well, Winston, Wise, and your father will help Dr. Morrison do the basic design work on a system to go into a weapon system." Scotty had been listening too. "How complicated can you get it?" he asked. Dr. Morrison answered, "When it comes to missile work, you can get fantastically complicated. In fact, some missile systems are so complicated it's a wonder they ever work at all." The telephone rang. Barbie, who served when necessary as the island switchboard operator, ran to answer. In a moment she returned. "It's for you, Steve, from Washington. I plugged it in on the library extension." Steve excused himself. A few moments later he returned. "Hartson, I just took the liberty of ordering a scrambler placed on your phone switchboard, in case we need to hold any classified conversations between here and my offices. The phone man will install it today if you have no objection." "Of course not," Hartson Brant said. "I think it's a sensible precaution, especially with one member of the team remaining in Washington." "What's a scrambler?" Barbie asked. a special device that turns phone conversations into jumbled gibberish so that no one can understand them. You talk normally and sound normal to the person listening, but anyone tapping in on the line gets only sounds that mean nothing. The agent's face turned grim. Speaking of gibberish reminds me of the reason for the call. The Washington Post carried a story in one of its columns this morning hinting that 2 scientists working on a super-secret project had been driven insane. It also hinted that the insanity was an effect of the gadget they were working on. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Electronic Mind Reader, a Rick Brant Science Adventure story by Harold L. Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Cinda J. M. Chapter 4, A Haircut and a Wink. Rick held the skywagon at the altitude to which he had been assigned by the control tower at Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington. He was a little nervous because there was more air traffic around him than he'd ever seen before. Across the Potomac, so close that the traffic patterns almost interlocked, was busy Washington National Airport. Below him, along the Anacostia River, were 2 military airports, Anacostia, at which he would land, and Bolling Air Force Base. And to complicate matters slightly, Andrews Air Force Base was only a short distance away. 1,000 feet above his head, a tremendous Air Force Stratocruiser circled patiently. 1,000 feet below him, a flight of Navy Banshee fighters awaited clearance for landing. And climbing through the pattern came a division of Air Force F-80s. Rick's neck ached from swiveling around. Scotty was helping him watch for other aircraft, but in the rear seat, Hartson Brants and Julius Weiss talked to Steadystream as they had ever since taking off from Spindrift. Rick wished he were as oblivious to the traffic. Actually, he didn't know what they were talking about. Good as his scientific training was, they were in a realm where his young mind hadn't even probed. His earphones gave out. Tower to Spindrift flight, you're cleared to land. Approach from northeast. Rick glanced down in time to see the Navy fighters peel off in a precision maneuver that was lovely to watch. Then, on their heels, he stood the skywagon up on a wing and slid down toward the muddy river below. A short time later, Rick called for instructions and was told to beach at Ramp 3. He located it without difficulty. Scotty climbed out of the pontoon and caught the rope thrown by a seaman. In a few moments, they were beached. A stocky young man, who might have been a government clerk, approached and introduced himself as Tom Dodd. The identification folder he held out bore the familiar Janig imprint. Steve phoned ahead, he said. Do you need anything for your plane? We better top off the tank, Rick said. Everything else is all right. He described the kind of gas his plane used, fearful that the Navy might use either a higher or lower octane that would not be suitable. Dodd gave instructions to a Navy petty officer, then led the Spindrifters to a waiting sedan. Rick got into the back seat and slumped back between his father and Weiss. The little mathematician looked at him in some alarm. Rick, you look done in. What on earth is wrong? He smiled feebly. I'm a sissy, Professor. The only other times I've flown into Washington, I landed at light plane airports outside the city. This morning, I got right in the middle of the big kids. Honest, the traffic was worse than Times Square. I was so scared I'd lose position and bang into someone that I almost swiveled my head off. Tom Dodd looked back and grinned sympathetically. Don't feel badly. Even the commercial pilots sit up straight and keep bright-eyed on the Washington approach. Airwise, it's one of the most crowded cities in the world. As Tom steered the big sedan expertly through the traffic en route to downtown Washington, Rick asked his father, What were you and Professor Weiss talking about? You lost me just about the time we got airborne. The scientist shook his head. This time, Rick, I can't help much. Ask me again when you've completed your undergraduate work in college. I'm afraid your father is right, Weiss said. When one gets deeply into the physical sciences, there are no longer simple mechanical analogies. There are only equations that I'm afraid are beyond you for now, Rick. Rick sighed. A lot of help I'm going to be on this project. You're not supposed to help, his father corrected. The project is entirely for the purpose of developing principles for the system. The final product will be the equations with which the technologists can begin actual system design. In other words, we are working only on the first theoretical step. But the newspaper article said the scientists were affected by a gadget, Scotty objected. The article was wrong. Paper covered with mathematical computations can scarcely affect anyone, Rick Brant said decisively. Rick steered through the window. The sedan was moving down Constitution Avenue toward 14th Street. But how did the newspaper find out anything in the first place? Dodd swung the sedan around a truck, then shrugged expressively. We'd like to know. Columnists have their sources of information. Usually, the source isn't close to the inside dope, so most of the columns are pretty inaccurate. A good thing, too. Otherwise, the enemy would be getting our top-secret information in print all the time. Probably this leak came from someone in the hospital where the team members were taken. Conversation lasted until Dodd swung the sedan into a restricted parking place near a corner of 15th and K Streets. Then he led the way into an office building. Rick looked around him as they walked to the elevators. It was a typical large office building with an arcade-type lobby. He noticed a haberdashery shop, a barber shop, a florist, a newspaper tobacco stand, and the entrance to a drugstore. The building directory was loaded with names. In the elevator, Dodd said, 4, please. The Spindrifters were the only ones that got off at that floor. As the door closed, Rick saw that a man was seated in an alcove just out of sight of anyone who got off the elevator. Dodd greeted him and then said, Remember these faces, Sam. Sam nodded without speaking. Dodd led them down a hall. Rick had to satisfy his curiosity. Is this a government building? No, it's a regular office building. We leased this floor under the name of a phony corporation. It's entirely ours, but the rest of the building is occupied by legitimate firms. Isn't that risky? Weiss asked. It depends. If the project is penetrated, then it becomes easier for the enemy in one way, since we don't have the protection of a government building. On the other hand, the public has free access to all but a few of the government buildings, while we can control who comes in and out of this floor. What does penetrated mean? Scotty inquired. Known to the enemy. But couldn't you have put the project in the Pentagon or the Atomic Energy Commission building? Rick pursued. Yes, except it's top secret, even within the government. I doubt that more than 24 people even know about it. Remember, the best security is not